Artemis II is coming soon, returning humans to cislunar space for the first time in nearly 54 years. Meanwhile, Starship is continuing its test flight program to finally reach orbit. Both of these programs are developing super heavy launch vehicles. So why does one of them throw away vehicles in the pursuit of learning, while the other is operational after just one flight? Stick around to find out. Sponsored by Outskill. The world of spaceflight has radically changed over the last few years. In just a short period of time, the US launch market went from only a few launches per month to now, where 3 super heavy launch vehicles are all gearing up to support NASA's Artemis program. NASA's Space Launch System, SpaceX's Starship and Blue Origin's New Glenn are all rockets that have recently been or are currently being developed. On November 16th in 2022, we saw the first launch of NASA's Space Launch System for the Artemis I mission, where it successfully carried an uncrewed Orion capsule on a mission around the Moon to test systems for the much anticipated Artemis II mission. Artemis I broke the long-standing record of the most powerful vehicle to ever successfully launch, a record previously held by the Saturn V. There was much to celebrate, but on April 20th, 2023, we saw the first full-stack flight of Starship, and this smashed the record just mere months after the first flight of SLS. Many thought that this would be the end of SLS, that we would cancel the entire program as Starship will change the launch industry and we would have no use for an expendable launch vehicle. Fast forward 3 years and SLS is about to perform its very first operational mission to fly crew around the Moon. New Glenn has successfully delivered 2 payloads into space and propulsively landed. Meanwhile, Starship has yet to reach orbit. So what happened? Why has the rapidly iterated Starship taken longer to come online than whatever development NASA and Blue use? Is one style of development better than the other? Or is there more to this story? Now I know I may have ruffled some feathers with that last comment. I know that you may say that it's not fair to compare these radically different vehicles, and we'll get to that. But despite this, it's still an important question to ask, and doing so will allow us to further understand the differences in how these rockets are designed, built and tested. To fully grasp how these different vehicles are created, let's go over the history of SLS and Starship, comparing how these 2 vehicles approach the incredibly complex task of rocket development. So let's start by looking at one of the most well-documented rocket development programs ever, to see how this first classification of development works. With SpaceX's Starbase positioned right next to a public highway and a beach, this has allowed us unprecedented access to view the development of Starship with day-to-day updates. You can even watch these developments live on our Starbase Live 24/7 livestream. If we go all the way back to December 9th, 2020, SpaceX launched the first flight of its high-altitude test campaign for Starship with SN8. SN8 was an early version of the modern-day Block 1 Starship that we've seen in the past, but with many differences. And many of these differences are clearly apparent, such as the lack of a heat shield or the lack of vacuum Raptor engines. But the more important changes SpaceX made after these early tests were much more subtle. These changes came about through these high-altitude test flights. During the first 12.5-kilometer flight, the vehicle demonstrated great control on ascent and atmospheric control during the belly flop maneuver. But during the flip landing maneuver, an issue with the header tank pressurization system caused one of the 2 landing engines to fail, resulting in a rather spectacular explosion upon landing. Now this flight was considered a success by many, and this was echoed on the SpaceX stream. The flight test allowed them to collect data for the next test flight, and SpaceX continued these flights from December 9th, 2020 to May 5th, 2021, when SN15 completed its test with a successful flight and landing. In total, there were 5 high-altitude test flights, with 4 of them resulting in some sort of rapid unscheduled disassembly. While these explosions may have seemed like a failure for the program, they were not unexpected at all. It was made clear by SpaceX during this test program that these vehicles were likely to explode at one phase or another during flight.
And a reminder, this is a test flight, second time we've flown Starship in this configuration. We've got a lot of good data.
This sort of fail fast attitude is one that SpaceX uses to try to test large-scale portions of the vehicle all at once, even if that means losing an entire vehicle. An example of this can be seen with SN9 and SN10 vehicles. Both vehicles were on the launch pad at the same time. Despite SN10's improvements over SN9, SpaceX still launched SN9 anyways, testing the vehicle even if a new and improved version was only 1 month away from being ready. This fail fast and iterate mentality was not just isolated to the high altitude test flight program, but also applied to full Starship flight tests. On April 20th, 2023, the first Starship test flight launched, marking a historic milestone in the Starship development program. Although, this first test flight was cut short. Leaks in the aft of Booster 7 fueled fires that damaged the hydraulic thrust vector control systems for the Raptor engines, leading to the vehicle losing control and doing a kerbal. Along with this, the flight termination system failed to successfully destroy the vehicle in a timely manner. With the lessons learned from Flight 1, Flight 2 switched over to an electric thrust vector control system, a fire suppression system, and a larger flight termination system. These improvements show the strength of this development method, being able to directly identify problems during a real flight and then improve the vehicles to address these shortcomings. Another field that sees rapid development and improvements is AI. We certainly keep hearing a lot about it. Soya has some insight in how you can upskill with our sponsor Outskill.
Recently, SpaceX acquired xAI as a way to integrate artificial intelligence into spaceflight applications. With AI having some very practical uses, now is a good time to learn how you can use it to your advantage with today's sponsor, Outskill. Outskill is the first ever AI-focused educational platform to accelerate AI learning for ordinary people, not just industry masterminds. And this weekend, they're hosting a live 2-day AI mastermind training event. And by joining with NSF's links and QR code, you get in completely free if you sign up in the next 48 hours. It's happening this Saturday and Sunday from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern, where you can learn about topics like generative AI tools, workflow automation, and no-code AI products. With more than 10 million AI-first professionals worldwide, this course isn't specific to any one area of industry, but is applicable to almost all of them, teaching you how to automate workflows even while you sleep, help build AI agents to create reports, and more. People from this very training have launched AI-powered services that bring in $3,000 to $4,000 weekly, with over 100 AI products shipped. They have a 4.9 out of 5 on Trustpilot and have already helped more than 10 million learners last year. You'll also get the AI Prompt Bible for attending Day 1, the AI Profit Roadmap for Day 2, and a personalized toolkit builder if you attend both days. You'll also get free lifetime access to more than 5,000 professionals, a more than $5,000 value. Seats are limited, so get in for free by using the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description. And thanks again to Outskill for sponsoring this video.
SpaceX launched several flights in a row, completing successive milestones which pushed the program in the right direction. That was until Flight 7. Flight 7 was a mission designed to test the new Block 2 of Starship and see how the modifications made to the heat shield and the flaps with the new version would change how the vehicle survived re-entry. But shortly after the booster was caught by the launch tower, the Starship upper stage broke apart, exploding over the Turks and Caicos Islands. While the root cause was identified, this was a failure for the Starship development program. Up to this point, all Starship flights had built on the past ones, justifying the cost of using so many test flights. But with the early loss of this ship, a lot of investment was lost as new data on the most important phases of flight, re-entry and landing, could not be collected. This began a string of flights and tests for Block 2 where progress seemed to stall. Flights 8 and 9 fell short of what Block 1 was able to achieve, and with the failure of Ships 36, a deeper look was needed at Starship before the next flight could proceed. It wasn't until Flight 10 on August 26, 2025 that the Block 2 curse was broken, and then proven with Flight 11 later that year on October 13th, with the successful final flight of Block 2. SpaceX's history of rapidly creating a vehicle can be characterized as a hardware-rich development style. Because of the complexity of Starship and so many unknowns, SpaceX designs the systems to the best of their ability and then finds the unknown unknowns through large-scale flight testing, leveraging a high manufacturing rate. This method is great for a vehicle like Starship that has hard to characterize systems, like thermal protection tiles. The downside to this methodology, however, is that it's extremely momentum based, because there is such a huge cost to testing each new batch of hardware. If you aren't learning more than the last flight, you are actively throwing away money. Moving backwards means this loss of momentum stalls development. After the anomaly during Ship 36's static fire testing, momentum was something that SpaceX needed. This is one of the reasons why they used the orbital launch mount for Starship static fires, while rebuilding Massey's in anticipation of Flight 10. They couldn't wait to rebuild Massey's. They had to find another solution to keep the program going. To summarize, SpaceX uses what we will call a hardware-rich development style. This type of development style utilizes expensive flight articles and physical hardware to develop a vehicle. Learning from failures, a vehicle's design is refined. But only when each test builds meaningfully on the last. If done right, this accelerates the timeline to operation, but only if the user has the capital and manufacturing ability to keep up. But what if you don't want to risk it? Well, let's now have a look at a completely different approach. NASA's Space Launch System is always a hot topic. In trying to compare its development with other vehicles, we run into the issue of politics. The hand of the United States government causes NASA-developed vehicles to always have an asterisk when being compared to other rockets. This is of course because NASA is always subject to the directives of Congress. But through looking at launch history and what SLS must achieve, we can gain an understanding of the development flow of SLS. For those unaware, NASA's Space Launch System, or SLS for short, is a super heavy launch vehicle that was developed for NASA's Artemis missions to return astronauts to the moon. The development of SLS has been a long story of delays and controversy, with development of the vehicle starting in 2011 and the first uncrewed launch of Artemis I occurring in 2022. Between those 11 years we saw no full-scale test flights like we've seen with Starship, and instead we only saw small-scale test articles on lower-risk tests. While these give extremely valuable data, they don't get rid of as many unknown unknowns as a full-scale test flight. Rather, NASA relies on simulations to fill in the gaps in testing and vice versa. So let's take a look at an example to see how these two, the tests and simulations, complement each other. On March 11, 2015, Orbital ATK performed the QM1 static fire of SLS's 5-segment solid rocket booster, followed by a second qualification test, QM2. These static fires are an example of a point where simulation can only take you so far. NASA reserves physical large-scale testing for the most important systems, in ways that mean a full stack is not needed. To test that the models and simulations developed to design SLS match real life, NASA performed a full rupture test of an SLS core stage tank, testing it all the way to failure. During this crash test at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in early December of 2019, engineers looked at the data from the test to ensure that SLS would perform similarly. After being loaded to 260% of flight loading, the tank ruptured. And while that safety factor is impressive, what's even more impressive is that Boeing engineers were able to predict exactly where it failed, to within 3% of the experienced loading. On such a complex piece of geometry, that is an absolute feat of engineering. Another set of very important tests was the SLS Green Run. At NASA's Stennis Space Center, NASA performed qualification tests on the SLS core stage in anticipation of Artemis I. The key words here are qualification tests. These tests are less about finding unknown unknowns and more about certifying that the simulation-rich development matches real life. For the SLS Green Run, the core stage underwent 8 tests, including modal tests to determine shaking modes, avionics testing, testing of fail-safes, pre-ignition propulsion operations, thrust vector control, a full wet dress rehearsal where the vehicle was filled with fuel, and then finally the full duration static fire with the SLS core stage.
Go for engine start.
H-buoys are on and engine starts has been okay. Engine starting up now.
Personnel, please continue to monitor your system and grass is in control.
which they then had to do again because it aborted on the first attempt, but I digress. Then there are some tests that cannot be performed on the ground. Either they are too important or they are not easily simulated. In these rare cases, NASA develops cheaper alternatives compared to launching a full stack to test these systems. An example of this is the Ascent Aboard 2 flight test, where a modified Minotaur rocket carried a boilerplate Orion capsule to test the launch escape system. During this launch, the Minotaur booster successfully took the Orion demonstrator to the most extreme flight regime required of it, and activated the abort system, safely pulling the test vehicle away. All of these tests resulted in minimal changes to the vehicle, and mostly in operational changes. This shows a different style of development to the very hardware-rich iteration of the Starship program. We call this simulation-rich. While SLS's development is not perfect, simulation-rich development makes sense for NASA. The SLS program is one that has to be extremely cognizant of public perception. If the general public, or more importantly Congress, views something like a launch failure, opinion on the program could cause a cancellation. Looking at the perception of Starship launch failures to the uninformed, these explosions are total failures for the program. And this is simply not something that SLS can risk. Along with this, the manufacturing timeline is just not fast enough to keep up with the hardware-rich timeline. SLS is a vehicle not meant to be produced at the same scale as Starship, and that can be seen with how it has been set up to fly. It doesn't make sense to fly SLS cores to test full systems when longer timelines and simulation can do the job. This results in a development style where the first launch might as well be operational, and by the second flight it's crew rated. On the Artemis I mission, SLS performed within just a few % of its targets in most fields, and it managed to put Orion in a near-perfect translunar injection burn. This lies in contrast to Starship, which after 11 flights and 3 years of full-scale flight tests is still not an operational launch vehicle. Granted, what SLS and Starship are built to do are radically different, but looking at the general sentiment within the spaceflight community around the time of Artemis I, this was certainly not a predicted outcome. Artemis II is a huge next step for NASA. It will be the first time NASA flies crew on a NASA-developed vehicle since the end of the shuttle program in 2011. The fact that NASA is choosing to put crew on Artemis II goes to show the value in simulation-rich development, to find as many unknown unknowns, and get a launch vehicle operational within a small number of flights. Now, if you want to commemorate the Artemis missions or any of the Starship test flights with a t-shirt, or decorate your walls with one of the beautiful prints from one of our photographers, we've got just what you need on shop.nasaspaceflight.com. In fact, we're releasing a whole series of Artemis II related designs throughout the launch preparations. Make sure you don't miss it, because they're really cool. While we can't compare SLS and Starship too closely, we can look at another vehicle that somewhat approaches Starship in complexity. On January 16, 2025, we witnessed a highly complex launch vehicle deliver a payload to medium Earth orbit on its first try, from using a simulation-rich development cycle. This vehicle, of course, was Blue Origin's New Glenn. While New Glenn itself did not successfully perform a propulsive landing on the landing platform Jacqueline, it did not impede the rocket's ability to perform its task of delivering customer payloads. On the second flight, carrying NASA's Escapade mission, the New Glenn first stage was able to make its landing. In this instance of New Glenn, we can see that simulation-rich development does not necessarily mean that it can only be applied to simpler vehicles. So we looked at the two development methods that SpaceX and NASA use, one being a hardware-rich development methodology, while the other is a simulation-heavy methodology. The big question is, which is better? Well, just like everything in aerospace, it's not as easy as that. It's not as easy as one is better than the other. It's a trade-off. Hardware-rich development values fast but risky iteration. It benefits from using real life as the environment to test hardware, meaning that unknown unknowns, things not accounted for in simulation, are found much quicker. This leads to a faster development cycle, as long as you have the manufacturing capability to keep up with the number of test flights. It also benefits programs that are doing extremely complex operations that have never been done before. The Starship program excels at development from this standpoint. Nobody knows how to test all the systems involved in catching a booster with a launch tower. That is something so new and so unique that learning from doing makes sense. While hardware-rich development may seem like the perfect technique, it's not the #1 choice for many programs. There are a few downsides. For hardware-rich development to take place, you need to blow up a lot of hardware. This can be prohibitively costly from a monetary and manufacturing capacity angle. Even if a vehicle is very rudimentary for doing a test flight, it's still a rocket. A very expensive vehicle. On top of this, there is the problem of momentum. Flights 7 through 9 of Starship were a massive loss. While SpaceX certainly learned things from these failures, these flights didn't push the boundaries and test the things that needed to be tested, especially around Starship Block 2 re-entry and landing. If in hardware-rich development you don't build on your previous testing, you lose momentum and a lot of money. Unfortunately, with the repeated failures of Starship Block 2, it puts into question the execution of this hardware-rich development cycle, even though it can be very powerful in the right circumstances. Simulation-rich development is the other side of the coin, highly valuing in-depth analysis of every part of a vehicle before anything sees flight. Companies that don't have the ability to constantly lose hardware highly value this option. It also shifts the cost from the hardware of entire vehicles to the cost of operations. Operational cost can mean that while the development of a vehicle may take longer, overall it may cost less. Looking at SLS and New Glenn, it has allowed these vehicles to become operational on their second flights. While the development of a vehicle using this method takes what seems like a safer route, it has a downside. If a major problem is found in development, it's much harder to do large changes to solve issues, as all previous simulations and testing must be tried again. And indeed, SLS has been plagued by massive delays before it finally got to fly in Artemis I. Every simulation-rich development cycle has some semblance of hardware testing, whether that be subscale test articles all the way to test tanks. Conversely, every hardware-rich development cycle is going to have plenty simulation behind every decision. Where a company lands on that gradient all depends on the circumstances of that rocket's development. Does a rocket need to be developed on an accelerated timeline? Or can more time be taken to reduce the number of development flights needed? What is the financial situation on the company? How much of a flight can realistically be simulated? It's all a spectrum. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to rocket development. The decisions that go into how a development program is run are a lot more complicated than a simple binary of iterative development or old space development. The spectrum of hardware-rich versus simulation-rich development is a tool that needs to be weighed against so many factors, whether it's speed, reliability, flexibility or cost. With SpaceX having such a monumental hold of the launch market, it can afford to lose a few Starships. But when a company like Astra, which does not have the financial backing but still tries hardware-rich development, it becomes harder to successfully execute on that strategy. For companies or organizations that may not have the short-term financial backing or are under particular scrutiny, longer simulation-heavy development as seen from Blue Origin and NASA just makes sense. So where do you think some other spaceflight companies rest on this spectrum? Should all spaceflight companies just drop everything and switch to hardware-rich rapid iteration? Or should there be more of a focus on the more slow and steady simulation-rich development approach? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to grab your free seat at Outscale's 2-day AI Mastermind by using the link in the description. Thanks again to Outscale for sponsoring this video. I'm Marty for NSF. Thank you so much for watching and be awesome everyone.